There are stories that begin quietly. A Tuesday morning that looks like every other Tuesday morning, coffee going cold on the counter, sunlight coming through a window at the wrong angle, nothing dramatic, nothing that warns you. And then, before you understand what is happening, the floor is gone and you are falling through a life you thought you knew. This is one of those stories. It takes place in Columbus, Ohio, in the kind of neighborhood where everyone waves from their driveway and nobody talks about what actually happens inside the houses. It is a story about a woman who was betrayed by the two people she trusted most, stripped of her freedom, her voice, and her dignity, all in the same week. And what happened 23 days later did not just change her life. It ended theirs as they knew it. My name is Rachel Calloway. I am 31 years old. I worked, at the time this story begins, as a logistics coordinator for a regional medical supply company in Columbus. I scheduled freight routes, managed vendor contracts, tracked compliance across 4 distribution centers, and made sure that hospitals received what they needed when they needed it. It was not glamorous work. It paid $54,000 a year. I drove a 2019 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard vent and a check engine light I kept meaning to address. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, the second bedroom converted into a home office where I kept color-coded binders and a whiteboard covered in route maps. I was organized. I was dependable. I was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who had her life under control. I had been with Daniel Marsh for 4 years. Daniel was 34, a regional sales director for a commercial real estate firm. He wore pressed shirts and knew how to order wine at restaurants and had the kind of easy confidence that made people trust him before he had earned it. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party. He laughed at something I said about logistics being the most underrated profession in America, and I thought, this one is different. For 3 years and 8 months, I believed that. I believed it through the weekends he canceled, through the work trips that ran longer than scheduled, through the slow cooling of something I could not quite name. I told myself every relationship has seasons. I told myself I was being impatient. I told myself a lot of things that kept me from looking directly at what was in front of me. My stepsister, Vanessa, came into my life when I was 19. My mother remarried a decent enough man named Gary Pryor, who came with a daughter 3 years younger than me. Vanessa was 22 at the time I am describing. She was studying marketing, partially funded by a monthly transfer from my mother's joint account with Gary. She was beautiful in the way that made people forgive her things they would not forgive anyone else. She had learned this about herself early and had been using it ever since. I did not dislike Vanessa. I want to be clear about that. I had tried, genuinely, to build something with her. We had dinner occasionally. I invited her to things. I texted back. I did the work that half-siblings are supposed to do. But there had always been something underneath our interactions. A small, consistent pressure, like a thumb pressing on a bruise, that I could never quite locate or name. The first thing I noticed was a receipt. It sounds almost embarrassingly small when I say it that way. A receipt. But that is how most true betrayals begin. Not with something dramatic, not with a scene, but with a piece of paper left in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had gone to Daniel's apartment on a Wednesday evening, a week before his birthday. I had a key. He had given it to me 18 months earlier in a moment of what I had interpreted as commitment. He was not home yet. I let myself in, set groceries on the counter, and began unloading. A paper bag had tipped on its side near the recycling bin. When I righted it, a restaurant receipt slid out onto the floor, dinner for 2. A Thursday night 3 weeks prior, the same Thursday, Daniel had told me he was in Cincinnati for a client dinner. The restaurant was 6 blocks from his apartment. The total was $214. There were 2 glasses of wine and a shared dessert. I stood in his kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's television murmured through the wall. I set the receipt on the counter and finished unloading the groceries because I did not know what else to do with my hands. By the time Daniel came home, I had made dinner and the receipt was in my jacket pocket and I said nothing. Not that night. I am not someone who reacts before I understand. I needed to understand. Over the following 9 days, I paid attention in ways I had not allowed myself to before. I noticed that Daniel had started putting his phone face down when I was in the room, a habit so new I could date its beginning almost precisely. I noticed he had begun going to the gym on Sunday mornings, which he had never done before, and returning 2.5 hours later, which was longer than any workout required. I noticed that when Vanessa's name came up in conversation, casually, the way names come up, he did not react the way people react to someone they barely know. He reacted the way people react to someone they are trying not to react to. Neutral in the way that is too neutral, still in the way that is too still. On a Saturday morning, 11 days after finding the receipt, I drove past Daniel's building at 9:45 in the morning. I told myself I was going to the farmer's market 2 streets over. I told myself I was not doing what I was doing. And then I saw Vanessa's car, a white Mazda CX-5 with a dent above the rear left wheel well that I had ridden in dozens of times, parked in Daniel's reserved space in the building's lower garage. I pulled to the curb. I sat for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard the way you watch something when your mind cannot process what your eyes are showing it. Then I drove home. I did not cry. I sat at my kitchen table and I made a list. What I am about to describe next is the part of this story that I have had to explain many times since, and the part that people struggle most to believe, not because it is extraordinary, but because it requires accepting that people who claim to love you can do something so calculated, so deliberate, so cold, that the mind reflexively rejects it as impossible. So I will tell it slowly, and I will tell it exactly as it happened. I called Daniel that evening. I told him I knew. I did not use Vanessa's name. I said I had seen enough and that I needed him to be honest with me. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to tell me everything. Then he said very calmly that he was worried about me. He said I had been under a lot of stress at work. He said I had been having trouble sleeping, which was true. I had mentioned this to him weeks earlier. He said he had spoken with my mother and with Gary, and that they were all concerned. He said this in the tone of someone reading from a script they had rehearsed, and in that moment, listening to him, I felt the first thread of something cold move through my chest. Not anger, not grief, something older and more animal than either of those things. Warning. I should say here that I had, several years earlier, gone through a difficult period following my father's death. I had seen a therapist for 14 months. I had, for a brief time, been prescribed a low-dose antidepressant. I had never been hospitalized. I had never been a danger to myself or anyone else. But I had been vulnerable, and I had been open about that vulnerability with Daniel because I had trusted him. I had handed him the map to the most private rooms in my history, the way you do when you love someone. And now, listening to him on the phone, I understood that he had kept that map. He had kept it, and he had shared it, and he and Vanessa and my mother and Gary had sat somewhere. A kitchen table, a living room, somewhere with normal furniture and normal lighting, and they had built something out of it. 2 days later, on a Monday morning, there was a knock at my apartment door at 7:15. I was dressed for work. I had my work bag over my shoulder and my coffee in my hand. I opened the door, and there were 2 people I did not recognize, a woman in blue scrubs and a man in a gray zip-up. And behind them, at the end of my hallway, were my mother and Gary. My mother had her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at me the way you look at someone you have already decided something about. The woman in scrubs said my name. She said they were there because people who cared about me had expressed serious concern. She used words like episode and wellness check and voluntary evaluation. She had a clipboard. Everything about her was professional and calm and completely immovable. I said I was fine. I said I was going to work. I said this was not necessary. I looked at my mother and I asked her what she had told them. She said quietly that I had called her the previous week saying things that frightened her. This was a lie. I had called her to ask about a family recipe. The call had lasted 4 minutes. I know because I checked my phone log standing in that doorway with 2 strangers between me and the rest of my life. I showed them the call log. The woman with the clipboard nodded in the way that people nod when they have already decided that whatever you show them is a symptom of the thing they have decided you have. She said sometimes people in distress do not recognize their own distress. She said this gently. She said it like a kindness. I want you to understand the particular horror of that moment. Not the loudness of it, because there was no loudness. No one raised their voice. There was no struggle, no scene. It was quiet in the way that a trap is quiet. I was a 31-year-old woman in a clean apartment with my work bag on my shoulder and my coffee going cold in my hand. And the people who were supposed to know me best had constructed a version of me that I did not recognize, and they had handed that version to strangers with clipboards. And the strangers had arrived at my door at 7:15 on a Monday morning with the calm authority of people who believed what they had been told. I was taken to Riverside Behavioral Health. Not in handcuffs. I want to be precise about this. I was not forcibly restrained, but I was also not free to decline. The evaluation that was supposed to last 72 hours stretched through a series of paperwork extensions and physician consultations that I later learned Daniel had influenced through a family friend who worked in hospital administration into 11 days. 11 days in which I had limited phone access. 11 days in which my apartment sat locked with my laptop inside. 11 days in which Daniel and Vanessa had the entirety of the situation and its narrative completely to themselves. What they did not know because they had not thought to ask, and because they had underestimated me in the specific way that people who believe they have won always underestimate the person they believe they have defeated, was what I had done the night before they came to my door. The night before the knock, Sunday night. I had spent the day thinking through what I knew and what I suspected, and I had understood, not emotionally, but logistically, in the part of my brain that schedules freight routes and manages vendor compliance, that I needed to move carefully. I knew Daniel worked with a commercial real estate firm. I knew, from things he had mentioned over 4 years of dinners and car rides and half conversations before sleep, that his firm had been involved in a property deal that had not gone the way it was supposed to. A land acquisition on the west side of Columbus involving a company called Meridian Property Group. Daniel had mentioned it 3 times, always briefly, always with a tightening around his jaw that I had attributed to professional stress. I had, over the previous year, processed enough vendor contracts and compliance documents in my own work to recognize the shape of something irregular when it appeared in conversation. The tightening jaw. The subject changed, the number mentioned once and then never again. I also knew the name Marcus Webb. I knew it because Daniel had said it the way people say the names of people they fear, quietly and only once, as if saying it a second time might summon something. Marcus Webb was the CEO of Caldwell Group, a commercial property investment firm based in Columbus. He and Daniel's firm had been on opposite sides of at least 2 major deals in the previous 18 months. Daniel called him aggressive. He called him ruthless. He called him the kind of man who does not stop once he starts. He said all of this with the particular energy of someone who is afraid of being found out by exactly this kind of person. On Sunday night, I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote a detailed email. I described the land acquisition. I described the irregularities as I understood them from what Daniel had shared. I attached nothing. I had no documents, not yet. But I wrote clearly and specifically, the way I wrote vendor compliance flags at work, the way I had been trained to communicate exactly what I observed without embellishment. I found the contact address for Caldwell Group on their website. I found a secondary inquiry address. I sent the email to both. I wrote my phone number at the bottom. I wrote that I might be difficult to reach in the coming days, but that the information was time-sensitive and that I was prepared to provide more detail when I was able. Then I closed my laptop, washed my coffee mug, and went to bed. And at 7:15 the following morning, there was a knock at my door. I did not know, lying in that facility in those 11 days, whether anyone had read the email. I did not know whether it had gone to a spam folder, whether it had been dismissed as the message of someone without credibility, whether Marcus Webb was the kind of man who paid attention to unsolicited contact from strangers. I had no way of knowing. I had made the move I could make with what I had, and then the board had been taken from me before I could see how the pieces landed. All I could do was wait. All I could do was stay calm, answer questions honestly, document everything I observed about the process of my own detention, and wait. What I did not yet know was that Marcus Webb had read the email within 4 hours of receiving it, that he had forwarded it to his legal team the same evening, that his legal team had flagged it as consistent with information they had already been quietly gathering, that by the time I was sitting in a group therapy room on the 3rd floor of Riverside Behavioral Health, staring at a motivational poster about resilience, Marcus Webb's attorneys had already begun pulling county records on the Meridian deal, and that one of his assistants had noted the phone number at the bottom of my email and the name Rachel Calloway, and had placed a reminder to follow up. I was lawfully discharged on day 11. The attending physician found no basis for continued holds. My own documentation of the process, dates, names, statements, everything I had written on paper and requested to keep went with me in a folder under my arm when I walked through the lobby doors into a gray Columbus morning that smelled like car exhaust in early spring. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel broken. I felt like a woman who has been underwater and has just broken the surface, and who understands, with complete clarity, that the people who held her under are still standing on the dock. I turned on my phone for the first time in 11 days. It took a long moment to load. When it did, there were 51 missed calls. There were 94 text messages. There was one email, received 9 days prior, from an address I did not recognize, with the subject line, Ms. Calloway, regarding your message to Caldwell Group. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. We believe we have a great deal to discuss. I stood on that sidewalk and I read that email twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and I walked to the corner and I called a cab. I did not call Daniel. I did not call my mother. I did not call Vanessa. I had nothing to say to any of them that required a phone call. What I had to say to them was going to arrive in a form they were not prepared for, delivered by people they had never considered, on a timeline they could not control. But that part of the story belongs to what came next. And what came next began with a meeting in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building downtown where a man I had never met stood up from behind a desk when I walked in, extended his hand, and said, Ms. Calloway, I've been hoping you'd call. I think you and I have some very important things to discuss. The office on the 14th floor of the Caldwell Group building smelled like cold air and fresh coffee, and the particular quiet of a place where serious decisions are made without drama. The carpet was charcoal gray. The windows ran floor to ceiling, and through them, Columbus spread out in every direction, ordinary and vast, the kind of city that looks manageable from above and overwhelming from inside. There were no motivational posters on these walls. There was a long conference table I was not taken to and a smaller sitting area near the window where 2 chairs faced each other across a glass table. And it was here that Marcus Webb gestured for me to sit. He was not what I had expected, though I realize now I had not known what I was expecting. Daniel had described him in the language of someone constructing a threat, aggressive, relentless, the kind of man who does not stop. What I saw was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with close-cut hair, and the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to be very patient in rooms where other people are not patient at all. He wore a navy jacket, no tie. He poured coffee without asking if I wanted it, set it in front of me, and sat down across from me with a legal pad balanced on his knee. He said, I want to start by telling you that what happened to you was wrong, and that I am sorry it happened. Now, I'd like to hear everything, if you're willing. Nobody had said that to me yet, not in 11 days, not in the facility, not in any of the carefully worded conversations I'd had with evaluators and social workers and physicians who spoke to me as though I were something fragile that might shatter if handled incorrectly. Nobody had sat across from me and said, what happened to you was wrong. The simplicity of it moved through me like cold water. I set my coffee down. I told him everything. I started at the beginning. The receipt in the kitchen. The 9 days of paying attention. Vanessa's car in the parking space. The phone call with Daniel and the way his voice had shifted into something rehearsed. The knock at the door at 7:15 on a Monday morning with my coffee in my hand. The 11 days. The paperwork I had documented. The email I had sent the night before they came for me, written at my kitchen table while the building was quiet, which was either the most rational thing I had ever done or the act of a woman who understood even then that she was about to lose access to everything except what she could set in motion before the window closed. Marcus listened without interrupting. He wrote things on his legal pad in small, even handwriting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he turned the legal pad toward me, and I saw that he had been writing not notes, but questions. Organized, numbered, structured, the way a legal argument is structured, each one building on the last. He said his team had already pulled the county records on the Meridian Property Group acquisition. He said that what I had described in my email, the irregularities, the numbers mentioned and then abandoned, the jaw tightening, was consistent with what his attorney suspected had been a fraudulent misrepresentation in the deal terms. He said Daniel's firm had presented property valuations to a third-party lender that did not align with independent assessments. He said this was not merely a civil matter. He said the word fraud, the way people say words, they have been careful about for a long time and are now finally ready to use out loud. I asked him why he was telling me this. I asked it plainly, because I had just spent 11 days in a room where nothing was plain, and I did not have the patience anymore for information delivered in pieces. He said because I had sent him the email. He said because the information I provided had given his legal team the specific entry point they needed into a paper trail they had been trying to locate for 8 months. He said because the woman who had written that email, organized, specific, unemotional, detailing observable facts without embellishment, was exactly the kind of witness that turns a civil case into something with real consequences. And then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "You did that the night before they came for you. You already knew you were going to need someone in your corner. I'd like to be that person, if you'll let me." I want to be careful here about how I describe what developed between Marcus Webb and me because I know how it sounds and I know the shape it takes in the telling. And I want you to understand that it was not what it sounds like in the way that stories like this usually sound like something. It was not immediate. It was not cinematic. What it was in those first days and weeks was professional and precise and built on a foundation of mutual usefulness that slowly, over time, became something else. But that comes later. What matters now is what we did first. His legal team connected me with an attorney named Patricia Osei, who specialized in civil rights and wrongful detention cases. Patricia was 53, had wire-rimmed glasses, and a handshake like a closing argument. And within 48 hours of meeting me, she had reviewed my documentation from the facility and identified 3 procedural irregularities in the extension of my hold that she described as actionable, in a tone that made that word sound like the beginning of something rather than the end. She filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. She sent a letter to the hospital administrator at Riverside. She requested, through proper legal channels, the full file on my admission, including the names of individuals who had provided statements supporting the initial wellness call. What came back in that file, 4 days later, was a statement signed by Daniel Marsh, a statement signed by Vanessa Pryor, and a statement signed by my mother. The statements described a phone call in which I had allegedly threatened to harm myself, a call that my phone records showed had lasted 4 minutes and which I had made to ask about a family recipe. Patricia read the statements and set them on her desk and looked at me over her glasses and said, "They put this in writing." That was their first mistake. I had moved, by this point, out of my apartment and into a short-term furnished rental across town. I had called my employer and explained that I had experienced a family emergency and requested 2 weeks of remote work, which was granted without difficulty because I had 12 years of combined professional references and had never once failed to deliver on a deadline. I had changed my passwords, my bank information, my emergency contact on every form that had one. I was rebuilding the perimeter of my life from the inside out, quietly and without announcement, the way you rebuild anything that has been damaged, not with noise, but with attention. Daniel called 44 times in the first week after my discharge. I know the exact number because I kept a log, because Patricia had told me to keep a log. Because a log is evidence, and evidence is the only currency that matters in rooms where your word has been pre-discredited by the people who are supposed to protect it. He left 17 voicemails. The early ones were concerned, sounding, still wrapped in the language of someone performing worry for an audience he imagined was listening. The middle ones were confused. Where was I? Why wasn't I responding? He just wanted to make sure I was okay. The later ones began to shed the performance. By the 9th voicemail, he was asking where I had gone. By the 12th, he was asking if I had spoken to anyone. By the 17th, his voice had taken on an edge that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with someone who has realized that the person they believed they had neutralized is no longer where they left her. Vanessa sent 61 text messages. I read them all. The early ones were the kind that are designed to look like olive branches but are actually reconnaissance. Rachel, I just want to make sure you're okay, and I know things have been hard. I'm here if you need to talk, and I feel terrible about everything that happened. The middle ones escalated into justification. You weren't well, Rachel. We were genuinely scared. And Daniel was worried. We all were. We did what we thought was right. The later ones abandoned the pretense entirely. One of them said, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. I screenshot every single one and forwarded them to Patricia. My mother called 22 times. I answered once on the 11th day because Patricia advised me to take one call on record. My mother said she had done what she did because she loved me. She said it in the way people say things they have rehearsed but not examined, smoothly, without hesitation, with the cadence of a truth rather than the construction of one. I said calmly that I understood she believed that. I said I wanted her to know that I was safe and that I was with people who were helping me. I said I would be in touch through my attorney. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear her breathing change. Then I said goodbye and ended the call. This is the part of the story that I need you to understand, because it is the part that people most often get wrong when they hear it. What I was doing in those weeks was not driven by anger. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Anger is reactive. Anger is hot and fast, and it makes you visible before you are ready to be visible. What I was operating on was something quieter and more durable than anger. It was clarity. For the first time in 4 years, maybe longer, if I am being fully honest, I could see the architecture of what had been built around me. I could see how Daniel's easy confidence had been, from the beginning, a form of management. How Vanessa's occasional warmth had always been transactional. How my mother's love had conditions attached that I had spent my whole life trying to meet without ever being told what they were. I could see all of it now from the outside. And from the outside, with Patricia beside me and Marcus's legal team pulling records and my own documentation, organized in a folder I kept in a fireproof box under my bed, I was not a woman in crisis. I was a woman with a plan. The plan had 3 components. The first was legal. Patricia's wrongful detention complaint, which was progressing through the state review process and had already prompted Riverside to conduct an internal audit of the admission. The second was professional. Marcus's attorneys, who were building a fraud case against Daniel's firm using the Meridian records, my initial email, and 8 months of their own prior research. The third was personal, and it was the one I had built myself alone in the quiet of a furnished rental apartment across town, with a cup of tea and my documentation and the particular focus that comes from having nothing left to perform for anyone. 3 weeks after my discharge, I received an invitation. Marcus Webb asked if I would be willing to meet with his legal team formally as a potential witness in the Meridian matter. He sent the invitation through Patricia, professionally, with a covering note that said the decision was entirely mine and that there was no pressure in either direction. I read the note twice. I thought about the Sunday night at my kitchen table, the email sent into the dark, the phone number written at the bottom like a thread left trailing. I thought about 7:15 in the morning and the clipboard and my mother's clasped hands at the end of the hallway. I wrote back and said yes. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There were 4 attorneys in the room, a paralegal, and Marcus, who sat at the far end of the table and said very little and watched the way people watch when they are deciding something. I answered every question precisely. I provided dates, context, and the specific language Daniel had used when referencing the Meridian deal across multiple conversations. At one point, one of the attorneys looked up from his notes and said, "You remembered all of this from conversations over 3 years?" And I said that I was a logistics coordinator, that my job was to hold large amounts of variable information in a stable structure, and that I had been doing it since I was 23. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. Something shifted in the room in a way that had no name but was entirely legible. After the meeting, Marcus walked me to the elevator. We stood for a moment in the hallway outside the conference room while his attorneys gathered their papers inside. He said my testimony was going to matter. He said it directly, without softening it into a compliment. Then he said something else. He said, "For what it's worth, whoever told you that you weren't well was wrong. You are one of the clearest thinking people I have encountered in a long time." The elevator arrived. I stepped in. The doors closed. I stood in the mirrored elevator and looked at my own face, and I thought, good, now let's finish this. What neither Daniel nor Vanessa nor my mother knew, as they sent their calls and their texts into a silence they could not interpret, was that the silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Every day I did not respond was a day the legal process moved forward without their knowledge. Every day I stayed calm and organized and removed was a day they remained in the architecture of a story they had built, unaware that the foundation was being quietly dismantled beneath them. They had sent me away to buy themselves time. What they had actually bought, without knowing it, was mine. The wrongful detention complaint was formally accepted for investigation by the State Review Board on a Thursday morning. Patricia called me at 8 a.m. to tell me. I was at my kitchen table, the same way I had been at my kitchen table on the Sunday night when this all began, with tea instead of coffee and a Columbus morning coming gray and ordinary through the window. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat for a moment. Outside, a car alarm went off briefly and then stopped. A dog barked twice. The city moved through its morning without any awareness of what was shifting inside it. I opened my laptop and I wrote 2 sentences in the document I had been keeping, a private record, dates and events, my own accounting of everything that had happened and everything that was happening. The sentences were, "Complaint accepted. Now we begin." I did not call Daniel. I did not text Vanessa. I did not reach out to my mother. I had nothing to say to any of them. Not yet. What I had was a legal process moving forward, a fraud investigation building momentum, a furnished apartment with a fireproof box under the bed, and a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday with Marcus Webb. Not with his attorneys this time, just the 2 of us at a restaurant downtown that he had chosen, which Patricia said he had described to his assistant as a personal meeting rather than a professional one. I sat with that for a moment. Personal. I was 31 years old, and I had been committed to a psychiatric facility by my boyfriend and my stepsister and my mother. And I had walked out 11 days later and moved across town and sent my documentation to an attorney and testified in a fraud case, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, the man who had received my Sunday night email had shifted incrementally from ally to something that did not yet have a name but was moving in a direction I could see clearly. I was not naive about what that meant. I was not swept away by it. I was a logistics coordinator. I understood systems. I understood that things move along tracks and that the tracks in this particular situation were heading somewhere specific, and that specific destination I was beginning to understand was not going to be a return to the life I had before Daniel and Vanessa and a Monday morning knock at my door. It was going to be something I had not planned for, because you cannot plan for everything. Some things you simply send out into the dark on a Sunday night and wait to see what comes back. Here is part 3. Full flowing prose, 3,000 plus words. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was a quiet Italian place on High Street. The kind with cloth napkins and candles in short glass holders and a noise level low enough that you could hear the person across from you without leaning in. I arrived 4 minutes early, which is how I arrive everywhere, and was shown to a corner table near the window. The city moved outside the glass. People with coffee cups, a delivery truck idling at the curb, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate the base of every parking meter. Ordinary Tuesday evening. The kind of evening that has no idea it is significant. Marcus arrived at exactly the time he had said he would. He shook my hand before sitting down, which struck me as both formal and genuine. The combination of a man who has good manners, not because he was taught to perform them, but because he actually respects the person in front of him. He ordered water and then looked at me across the table and said, without preamble, that he wanted to have dinner and talk about something other than the case. He said his attorneys had everything they needed from me professionally, and that this evening, if I was agreeable, he would like to know who Rachel Calloway was before all of this happened. And also who she intended to be after. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said that those were two very different questions, and that the honest answer to the first one was that I was still figuring out how much of the person I had been before was real, and how much had been constructed to fit a space that other people had decided I should occupy. He nodded slowly. He said he understood that more than I might expect. He said he had spent a significant portion of his 30s dismantling a version of himself that had been built to satisfy other people's ideas about who Marcus Webb should be, and that the dismantling had been the most important and most uncomfortable work of his life. We ordered food. We talked for 2.5 hours. By the end of the evening, I understood that whatever was developing between us was not gratitude on my part or strategy on his. It was something more straightforward and more surprising than either of those things. It was recognition. Two people who had learned, through different routes and different costs, how to see clearly. I will not compress what took months into a paragraph because it deserves more than that and because the timeline matters. Over the following 11 weeks, as the legal processes moved forward on their separate tracks, Marcus and I had dinner 6 more times. We walked along the Scioto River on a Sunday afternoon in early May when the light was flat and silver and the city smelled like mud and new grass. We had coffee in his office on a Saturday morning when neither of us had anywhere else to be, going through documents side by side at the long conference table while the building was empty and quiet around us. He was not rushing anything, neither was I. We were both people who had learned, at significant cost, the price of moving faster than understanding. What I need to tell you about now, though, is not the romance of it. What I need to tell you about is the Thursday morning in late April, approximately 6 weeks after my discharge. When Daniel Marsh arrived at his office building to find a notice from the Ohio Division of Securities taped to the glass door of his firm's suite on the 3rd floor, his assistant called him before he reached the elevator. By the time he stepped out onto the 3rd floor, there were 2 investigators in the lobby of his firm with a document box and a look of professional neutrality that told Daniel everything he needed to know about how his morning was going to go. I was not there. I want to be clear about that. I was at my rental apartment on a work call about a freight compliance issue in one of our distribution centers, drinking coffee and making notes in the margin of a vendor contract. I learned about it later from Patricia, who had been kept informed by Marcus's legal team as a professional courtesy. She called me during my lunch break and said simply, "It started this morning." I said I understood. I thanked her. I finished my lunch. I went back to work. The fraud investigation into the Meridian Property Group acquisition moved quickly once the Division of Securities became involved. What Daniel's firm had done as it was reconstructed through the records and supported in part by the testimony I had provided was present inflated property valuations to a third-party lender in order to secure a loan at terms the actual property values would not have supported. The difference between the presented valuations and the independent assessments was $340,000. The lender had relied on those figures in good faith. When the investigators pulled the internal communications from Daniel's firm, emails, which people always believe are more private than they are, they found a thread in which Daniel had been directly involved in approving the valuation figures before submission. He was not a peripheral figure. He was, as one of Marcus's attorneys described it to Patricia, central to the decision chain. Daniel's firm placed him on administrative leave within 72 hours of the investigation becoming active. This was described publicly as a precautionary measure, pending the outcome of the inquiry. What it actually was, as anyone who has ever watched an organization protect itself understands, was the firm creating distance between itself and the person it had already decided was the expendable variable. Daniel went from regional sales director to administrative leave in 3 days. His company email was suspended, his access card stopped working. He arrived at the building on a Friday morning, and the security guard at the desk, a man he had nodded to every day for 2 years, asked him to please wait while he made a call. I know the specific number of times Daniel called me in the 72 hours following his administrative leave because I had kept the log continuously since my discharge. In those 3 days alone, he called me 31 times. He sent 47 text messages. The early ones were still attempting to perform normalcy. "Rachel, I really think we should talk, and I know things have been complicated, but I need to hear your voice." The middle ones dropped the performance entirely. One said, "I know you're involved in this somehow. I don't know how, but I know it." One said, "You need to tell them that you misunderstood what I told you. You need to fix this." That one I read twice. "You need to fix this." As though the thing that required fixing was my understanding, and not the 340,000 misrepresentation he had signed off on. The last message he sent in that window said, "Rachel, please, I know I hurt you, I know what we did was wrong, but this is my career, this is my whole life. Please." I read it standing in my kitchen on a Saturday morning with the window open and birds going about their uncomplicated business in the tree outside. I thought about 7:15 in the morning. I thought about a clipboard and 2 strangers and my mother's clasped hands at the end of the hallway. I thought about 11 days and a motivational poster about resilience and a phone with no access and a legal pad of questions from a man who had said the words, "What happened to you was wrong." I set my phone face down on the counter. I made more coffee. I did not respond. Vanessa's reaction was different, and in some ways more illuminating, because it revealed something about her character that the previous months of careful performance had concealed. When she understood that Daniel's professional situation was serious, I believe she heard it from Daniel directly, in whatever conversations they were having that I was not part of. She did not stand by him. She pivoted. She called my mother and told her that Daniel had pressured her into going along with the wellness call, that she had never felt comfortable with it, that she had been trying to protect me in the only way she knew how. My mother, to her credit, or perhaps simply to her instinct for self-preservation, repeated this version of events to Patricia during a follow-up conversation that Patricia had initiated as part of the wrongful detention complaint process. Patricia noted the inconsistency between this version and the signed statement Vanessa had submitted supporting the initial wellness call. She noted it carefully and added it to the file. Vanessa sent me a message in the first week of May that was 4 paragraphs long. I will not reproduce all of it because some of it was designed to provoke a response, and I had no interest in providing one. What I will tell you is that it began with, "I made a mistake," and ended with, "I hope someday you can forgive me," and in the middle, buried between expressions of remorse that may or may not have been genuine, was a single sentence that told me everything I needed to know about where Vanessa actually stood. The sentence was, "Daniel convinced me you were a danger to yourself, and I believed him because I wanted to. I want to because I wanted to, not because the evidence supported it, not because she had observed something that genuinely frightened her, because she had wanted to, which meant there was something she had wanted to make space for, and the space she had wanted to make was in my life, with my boyfriend, in the place I had occupied." I saved the message. I forwarded it to Patricia. I did not respond. The State Review Board completed its investigation into my wrongful detention in the second week of May. The finding was that the procedural extensions of my hold had not been adequately supported by clinical evidence, and that the admission process had been initiated based on third-party statements that contained factual inaccuracies, a careful bureaucratic way of saying that people had lied, and that the institution had not done sufficient due diligence before accepting those lies as the basis for holding a person against her will for 11 days. Riverside agreed to a settlement that included a formal acknowledgement of the procedural failures, a financial component that I will describe only as meaningful, and a commitment to revised intake protocols. Patricia sent me the settlement confirmation on a Tuesday afternoon. She said in her characteristic tone of understatement that it was a good outcome. I sat with that for a long time. I need to tell you about the confrontation, because there was one, though it was not the kind of confrontation you might expect. It did not happen in a parking lot or on a doorstep or in the middle of a family gathering with everyone watching. It happened in the lobby of a building on a Wednesday afternoon in late May when I walked in for a meeting with Patricia and found Daniel sitting in one of the lobby chairs, apparently having arrived for the same building for an unrelated reason related to his ongoing legal situation. He saw me before I saw him. By the time I noticed him, he was already standing, already moving toward me with his hands open in the gesture people use when they want to communicate that they are not a threat. He looked diminished. That is the only word I have for it. Not physically, he was the same height, the same build, wearing a pressed shirt the way he always had. But something behind his eyes had collapsed. The easy confidence was gone. What was there instead was something raw and unorganized, the look of a man who has been living inside a story about himself and has just discovered that the story was wrong. He said my name. He said he needed 5 minutes. He said he knew he had no right to ask, but he was asking anyway. I stopped walking. I looked at him. I said, "You had me committed to a psychiatric facility to buy yourself time. You signed a statement containing things you knew were not true. You used information I gave you in confidence about the hardest year of my life as a tool to discredit me. I need you to understand that I know exactly what you did and why you did it. I need you to understand that it did not work. And I need you to understand that everything that is happening to you right now is the direct result of choices you made, not things that were done to you." He opened his mouth. I said, "You told me I wasn't well. You were wrong about that too." Then I walked past him to the elevator and I did not look back. That was the last time I spoke to Daniel Marsh. His legal situation resolved several months later in a way that involved significant financial penalties, a civil judgment in favor of the lender, and the permanent end of his career in commercial real estate in the state of Ohio. I did not attend any proceedings. I did not track the details in real time. I had given my testimony, I had provided my documentation, and then I had stepped back and allowed the process to do what processes do when they are properly initiated. The machine did not need me to watch it work. Marcus Webb and I were married the following October. I want to tell you this plainly because I think the plainness of it matters. We did not get married because of what had happened. We did not get married as a statement or a reversal or a closing image in someone else's story. We got married because over the months of dinners and river walks and Saturday mornings in empty conference rooms, we become the kind of necessary to each other that does not announce itself dramatically but simply settles in, like something that was always going to be there once the wrong things had been cleared away. He is the kind of man who pours coffee without asking, who listens to completion before he responds, who said, on a Tuesday evening in an Italian restaurant, that he wanted to know who I was before all of this and who I intended to be after, and who meant both questions with equal sincerity. We were married in a small ceremony in Columbus, 31 people. Cloth napkins. Good wine. My documentation folder was in a drawer at home and would never need to be opened again. My mother was not invited. I made that decision slowly, over weeks, and I made it without anger and without drama and without a phone call explaining my reasoning, because my reasoning was my own and did not require her validation or her understanding. She had signed a statement containing a lie. She had stood at the end of my hallway with her hands clasped and watched 2 strangers take me away and called it love. I did not hate her for it. I understood that she had, in her own limited way, been doing what she believed she was supposed to do, which was defer to the man beside her and the story he had constructed. Because that was what she had been doing for so long, it had become invisible to her as a choice. I understood it. I did not excuse it. Those are different things, and learning the difference between them was, I think, the most important thing I took from all of this. Vanessa. I have not spoken to since. I do not wish her harm. I genuinely do not. She is a young woman who made choices shaped by wanting something that belonged to someone else, wanting it badly enough to justify the cost of taking it, not understanding until too late that the cost would not be paid by her alone. I hope she is well. I hope she is learning something about the weight of what she did. I do not intend to be present for that process. What I want to tell you, now, at the end of this, is the thing I have been circling since the beginning. Because every story like this has a lesson embedded in it, and the lesson is not always the one that sounds best from the outside. The lesson is not that patience is rewarded, or that justice is reliable, or that every betrayal eventually collapses under its own weight, though all of those things were true in my case. The lesson I actually learned, the one that changed how I move through the world, is this. I had spent 4 years making myself smaller to fit inside Daniel's idea of what I should be. I had spent my whole life making myself quieter to fit inside my family's idea of what I should be. I had mistaken that shrinking for love. I had told myself that accommodation was kindness and that endurance was loyalty and that the discomfort I felt was my own failure to be grateful enough for what I had. They had trained me to stay small. They had done it so consistently and so gradually that I had stopped being able to see the bars. It took a Monday morning and a clipboard and 11 days in a room I did not choose for me to understand, finally and completely, that the smallness was never mine. It was always theirs. It was always a requirement they had placed on me because my full size was inconvenient to what they were doing. I am not small anymore. I am a logistics coordinator who became a witness, who became a wife, who became the person she was before anyone told her she should be less. I keep a clean apartment. I drive a newer car. I have a whiteboard in my home office covered in route maps. I drink my coffee before it goes cold. And on Sunday mornings, sometimes I sit at the kitchen table in the early light, and I think about a woman who sat in this same posture at a different table in a different apartment. On a Sunday night when everything was already beginning to fall, and I think about what she did. She did not scream, she did not confront, she did not beg or bargain or perform. She sat down at her kitchen table and she wrote an email and she put her phone number at the bottom and she sent it out into the dark and then she went to bed. And that was enough. That has always been the thing I want people to understand. You do not have to be loud. You do not have to be fearless. You do not have to know how it ends. You only have to do the next precise thing, and trust that the doing of it is already more powerful than anything they planned for. Love that demands your silence is not love. It is control dressed in the language of love. And it has been wearing that costume for so long that sometimes you cannot see it until it shows up at your door at 7:15 in the morning with a clipboard and the faces of people you trusted. When that happens, and I hope it never happens to you, but if it does, do not let it make you loud. Let it make you precise. Let it make you documented and methodical and unreachable in the specific way that people who have decided to be free are unreachable. Let it make you, finally and completely and without apology, exactly the size you actually are. So here is what I want to ask you. If you were sitting at that table, would you have stayed or walked out? Comment one word. Leave if you would cut contact. Chance if you believe family always deserves one more chance.